This one will be a short one, about an hour. It's a David Ward interview, two-parter. Um, picking it up from Chaos View. Hopefully I don't end up with freaking copyright BS over this, but anyway, here it goes. Y'all make up your own minds. I think sounds like the interviewer on this is guiding Ward, and then of course Ward is, we seen his reactions after they killed the boy, and he was like a stripper dancing with guys. Anyway, so here we go.
Good afternoon, folks. This is Sheriff Ozzy Knezovich with the Sheriff's Report. Today we have a very special program, and it is my great honor to have what I consider a true constitutional sheriff in studio with me today. He's an individual that you watched part of his life play out on CNN and Fox and all the news channels. He's an individual that really stood his ground, showed people what a true sheriff should really be like. And I take my hat off to him because he's only really been in the seat for 10 months. This individual has won the respect of many sheriffs across the United States, and he's won my respect. And his name is Sheriff Dave Ward from Harney County, Oregon. And if you're not familiar with that, I don't know where you've been, because there's been a lot of coverage about Harney and the takeover of the Mauer Wildlife Refuge by a group of individuals that you've heard me talk about multiple times on this radio show. And I think it's really important that you get a perspective from the individual that actually had to deal with these folks. Because I just had the opportunity to sit with the sheriff for almost 3 hours and listen to his story, and listen to, quite frankly, the amount of falsehood that was put out by a lot of people in reference to this. So, Sheriff, really casual conversation. The early days. You talked a lot about the early days prior to the actual protest, prior to the actual takeover, because this didn't just happen in a vacuum. This didn't just happen they showed up, they had a protest, and decided, well, it's time to go to the refuge. This had quite the buildup starting in November, and I don't think a lot of people understand that. I don't think that a lot of people understand that this was actually a two-month prelude to what happened.
Fucking really?
And there's a lot of people that had those conversations with you, but let's talk about who was the first one that got a hold of you?
Well, first of all, it was just about exactly 10 months into office when this began for me, and this started on November 5th of last year. The phone calls began early on, and the case in which they were referring to was the Hammonds case. I wasn't familiar with it. I wasn't sheriff at the time that case had taken place, and so I was a little bit behind the power curve, and as far as having to get caught up and understand what people were talking about. I was contacted on November 5th by Ammon Bundy, and he wanted to meet with me. Prior to that, I had received phone calls from a lady named Michelle Fior out of Nevada.
Now, she's kind of like a county commissioner or state representative or something down in that area?
Yes, she left a message that she was a state assemblywoman from Nevada, wanted to speak with me. I ended up meeting with Ammon Bundy and a gentleman by the name of Ryan Payne prior to contacting her back. That first meeting, it started out pretty casual. As a matter of fact, Mr. Bundy's a pretty pleasant person to sit down and have a conversation with. And Mr. Bundy had explained to me quite a bit about his stance on the BLM, how he had felt about the Hammonds case in particular. He felt as though they had been mistreated by the federal government. And Mr. Payne didn't have a lot to say during that meeting. He would give input here and there, and kind of felt like he was there to keep Mr. Bundy on track.
He actually, the way you kind of described it at our last meeting, was the guy that was in the room giving you the 1,000-yard stare, kind of a slightly intimidation factor.
I believe that was the intent. Mr. Payne keeps a pretty intense look on his face. Looked through me through a good portion of the conversation, and let Mr. Bundy do the majority of the talking. Now, somewhere in the middle of that conversation, it was about a 2-hour meet and greet, in which I sat down with them. I had recognized the Bundy name. I wasn't 100% familiar with him, and in the several hours leading up to, between him calling and wanting to meet with me and actually sitting down with them, I spent a good portion of that time researching the incident in Bunkerville, Nevada, in which the Bundy family was involved. And in all honesty, it made me feel a little bit nervous about why these guys were in my community and what they were truly up to. I visited with them quite a bit. I told them, that they were welcome to protest. They were welcome to use, their rights within the boundaries of the law, and that I supported that. However, that I could not have what happened in Bunkerville, Nevada, happen in Harney County, Oregon. That I wasn't going to tolerate that kind of activity. In fact, I wasn't going to tolerate it from citizens, and I wasn't going to tolerate it from law enforcement. That we have a peaceful community made up of fantastic people, and that's not the way we live our lives out there.
Did they give you any indication or any reassurance that, no violence, we're just here to protest and support the Hammonds?
It was made pretty clear to me that if I went along with their game plan or along with their agenda, that everything would be all right. Mr. Payne actually mentioned, when I stated that I couldn't tolerate bloodshed in our community, at one point indicated that as long as I went along with their game plan, which was to tell the federal court system that they had no authority over citizens in Harney County, that could be avoided. Now, there was a lot of saber rattling and ultimatums that were handed out in that first set down. They told me what they felt my duties were as a sheriff, in that they wanted me to kick what they deemed as unconstitutional agencies out of our community. There was a lot said in there, but the ultimatums were given that if I didn't do my job according to what they thought it was, that they would bring thousands of people to town and do that job for me.
You mentioned not just that they make that threat, but they basically made the threat to basically overthrow your government, and that they were working with people to do just that, to overthrow the government.
That was in a conversation that took place on November 19th, when Mr. Bundy came back with a group of 10 people. During these meetings they'd show up to my office, and they were generally armed. In that specific instance, they left an armed overwatch outside the sheriff's office.
Now, Dave, let me make sure I explained that to citizens that may not understand that term, armed overwatch. Folks, what the sheriff is saying is these individuals actually left lookouts, armed lookouts, to ensure that nothing happened on the outside. And that was a common theme throughout the entire thing. When you'd have meetings at the citizen group meetings and things like that, they would actually come, they'd infiltrate your meetings, and they'd leave 10 to 20 people outside as a quick response team, which, folks, that means if anything happened inside, they had 25 armed people to go inside. So fairly intimidating to have armed individuals walk in and you know that they've left somebody outside, because you had, what, 4 deputies in your county? That's it, you and 4.
We're a very small agency. I have 4 patrol deputies, a lieutenant and 3 deputies. My lieutenant also oversees the jail for me, in which I have 6 corrections deputies, but they're not trained to respond to those type of situations. Now, in this instance, I was in the office by myself. I had to bring a guy out of the jail and take him up with me to basically sit in the room with me while I met with these folks. 10 of them came up there. It was a small room, and 6 or 7 of these guys were open carry, sidearms. And again, there was a lot of saber rattling, if you will. The same ultimatums that were given in the first meeting. They went around the room, explained which organizations they were with. They call themselves patriot groups. There were multiple groups represented there that day. And again, the ultimatums were given that the Hammonds don't spend one more day in jail. Now, the issue that arises with that is the Hammonds were sentenced back to prison. It's not a double jeopardy issue, but they were resentenced to prison after the initial sentencing judge had deviated from the mandatory minimum sentencing law. Now, as the county sheriff, my job in Oregon is outlined by law. It is mentioned in the Oregon Constitution, but the Oregon Constitution refers us to the law. And the laws for the duties and responsibilities of the sheriff are cut and dried. And one of them is to uphold the orders of the court. Now, in the Hammonds case, that went up to the Ninth Circuit Court on appeal, and the Ninth Circuit Court upheld that they needed to fulfill the mandatory 5-year minimum sentencing. So,
and this was a plea deal. A lot of people don't realize this part. The Hammonds actually agreed to the sentence, correct?
They did agree to the sentence, but they agreed to the sentence prior to the first judge deviating from it.
Right.
Now, I think that most of us probably agree that our government needs work at every level. There's state and county, local, federal, but the fact remains there's lawful channels that we all have to work through to make that work. And as citizens, no, we can't afford to be complacent. As citizens, we have responsibilities to make sure that we get out and vote, and that we are informed, and that we inform our neighbors. And we have the freedom here in America to do that, and it's an amazing thing.
Our founding fathers gave us the recipe on how we are to conduct ourselves under the Constitution of the United States, and these people really don't care about the Constitution. They're more about their own agendas. On the 19th of November, you met with them, and you had done a lot of research on the Hammond situation. You basically handed them the whole Hammond case, all the facts, and told them that, you're wrong, here's the facts. Once they determined that you were, and this is the words they love to use, folks. They've called me the same term because I don't condone what's gone on here. Once they determined that you were a traitor, you were a tyrant, How did that change for you? Because as soon as you give them the facts, suddenly you're not such a friendly guy.
Well, as soon as they realized that I was not going to embrace, I guess, their agenda, my office began getting flooded with phone calls and emails. And what they did, it was they put out what they call a call to action on social media. Now, these folks are very well networked in with each other, and they use social media very much
As a weapon.
Absolutely. In a manner as the military would use a recall roster for their unit. And so we began receiving phone calls to the point that it literally shut our dispatch center down to the point that we couldn't fully provide the emergency services needed.
And that's your 911 center.
Absolutely. Our business number rings into the dispatch center 24 hours a day. And these folks, they put that information out. It's public information, but they put those contact numbers out there and encourage people to call in and express their dissatisfaction with my stance. Another thing that they used was email. I've received several thousand emails throughout the course of this. Many of them, laced with profanity and insults and a lot of angry responses. The threats actually started coming in after I started putting out the information to show that what was being spread on social media was untrue. So the things that I put out there, one, I made a flow chart of how the case had come along, and it basically started with the sheriff's investigation. In that case, with the Hammonds case, the sitting sheriff was the one who actually did the investigation.
Now, that's an important part because the Ammon Bundy and his crowd always said it was the evil feds that had come in and done all this, and they never once brought that salient fact out that, no, it was actually the elected sheriff of Harney County at the time that did those investigations.
Yes, it was. And in this flow chart, it basically went all the way through and up to the Supreme Court. See, the Hammonds were tried, and at the end of that trial, I believe they dropped a significant number of the counts against them, and they went ahead and accepted a plea deal for the mandatory minimum of 5 years. The judge at that time deviated from that. He gave one of them 12 months and the other one, I believe, 3 months. And the prosecution, on the other hand, appealed that. And now that appeal went up to the Ninth Circuit Court, which upheld the mandatory minimum sentence. And here's why I don't believe it was, an act of vengeance or anything like that on behalf of the prosecution. The fact was that if they didn't appeal that, then it allows the law to get watered down. That mandatory minimum sentencing law now loses credibility through poor case law precedents. And so when the Ninth Circuit upheld that, the defense appealed. It went up to the Supreme Court, which said they weren't going to hear the case, and handed it back down for resentencing. And so my issue with Bundy's and their stance is that this was a lawful and binding court sentence that was handed down. It wasn't a case of double jeopardy. It wasn't a case of persecution or tyranny. It was in accordance with the laws that were made through our government process, which is outlined in the Constitution.
You mentioned in our briefing that after you confronted Ammon with all the facts and that, he actually got on social media and said a lot of untruthful stuff, that he called you and said, oh, by the way, I've said this stuff. Talk about a little bit of the frustration that you had in that these people are feeding the American people falsehoods, and you're sitting there trying to combat the falsehoods with the truth. And I'll tell you, I was highly critical of media, national and otherwise, for not diving deeper into this earlier and getting to the facts, because some of that rhetoric actually became part of the real media story. And I'm like, that's not true. What was it like when you get a call from Ammon going, oh, by the way, I've said this, and you know that it's just flat not true?
I found it everything that he puts out or their organization puts out onto social media or into the media, or in writing for that matter, is directed at provoking an emotional response from the listener or the reader. In that case, I had put out information, put out factual information, the actual documentation, the copies of the police reports into their hands, grand jury indictments, the word-for-word transcripts from the actual resentencing, which were 7 pages long, and cleared up a significant amount of the misinformation that had been put out on the internet. Mr. Bundy's response to that was to put out a video onto social media claiming that federal agents had contacted the Hammonds family attorneys and threatened to have the Hammonds killed if they didn't stop associating with the Bundys. Now again, I think that most normal people would provoke some kind of an emotional response. That said, to me, I knew it absolutely was untrue.
As a matter of fact, you called the Hammonds and went heads up.
I gave Dwight Hammond a call and asked him about it, and he said that wasn't the case, and that they were all right. But Mr. Bundy continued to run down that path. And the fact is that, it's flat out lie. And I struggled with why people would even buy into it, because what kind of sense does it make for a federal agent to call somebody's attorney and say, I'm going to murder your client? I'd say that probably, well, it'd be kind of a bad decision.
It would be. And the thing is, sadly, Dave, we have people out there that actually buy into that. I watched the fallout from many of those conversations and many of the things that came out of Harnett County right here locally with, groups like the Spokane Liberty Caucus and the Constitution Republicans of Spokane County. They all buy into this rhetoric. And, what was it like when a group of legislators from outside your area, from outside your state, came and tried to influence what happened here? That caused you a wee bit of problems.
It did. I think that one of the things that these folks are shooting for is any time that they can get an elected representative to pay attention to their cause or fall into their agenda, it lends them credibility, and they use that. And so for elected officials to speak out, on behalf of something like this, or to get involved in something like this without taking the time to research it and base their opinions off of facts, absolutely does our entire nation a disservice. In fact, I believe it puts good citizens in jeopardy of falling into harm's way, because Ryan Payne looked me in the eye and told me that he was working with a group of individuals to replace our current government. Now, He didn't say I'm looking into a way to vote people out of office, and he didn't say that he was looking into ways to inform people and start a political movement. These people talked specifically about bringing thousands of people to town or arming people because they didn't feel that their votes counted enough.
Basically 1776. That's the common theme that you hear from them. You know, and it's 1776, it's revolution, it's that type of mantra that is actually driving this forward. Let's talk a little bit about Ryan Payne and some of these folks. Not savory characters, because you mentioned many of them were criminals.
I can't go into their criminal histories. Ryan Payne didn't necessarily have one, but a lot of the people that associated with him and showed up out there had a lot of criminal history. There were a lot of folks that showed up out there that really had no dog in the fight other than they were looking to make some trouble.
And stolen valor also, because Ryan Payne is all about stolen valor.
Ryan Payne introduced himself to me on several occasions as an Army Ranger, and one, I believe he thinks that's intimidating. Secondly, there were multiple people in that organization who introduced themselves as having military records that I later found they did not have. In fact, at one point, I mentioned him being an Army Ranger, and an FBI agent who stated that he was an Army Ranger said, "That's not the case, and a copy of his military records are right over there." So I find it disappointing because I'm a retired soldier. I spent a little over 8 years of active time and finished my retirement out in the reserves. And I was served in combat on two different continents, in Somalia and in Afghanistan. And I've served on funeral details in 3 different states and folded our flag over numerous caskets of true patriots. And I have to say that watching people hijack my flag and wave it around while actively committing felonies turned my stomach.
Mine too. I'm also a veteran. And to sit and watch people claim to be a veteran and claim to be a patriot, I'm sorry, folks, they're not patriots. They're thugs. And that's just the way it is. They are thugs that want, if you don't believe in the way that they believe, they come after you, and they come after you in a very big way. And it's to the point where they love these buzzwords, tyranny. You know, that's when you're tyrants and tyranny and everything else. But I will submit this to you. They are, in fact, the true tyranny. They are, in fact, the true tyrants, because only tyrants and only tyranny use that type of persuasion and that type of bully tactic. If you don't agree with me, we're coming after you. And here, folks, we're going to have a 2-part show. This is part 1. And in part 2, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the bullying that you've had to live through, what your community had to live through, what your families had to live through, to the point where, you have, and I hate using the term because I hate even thinking that he once wore a badge in the same title as we do. A former sheriff from Arizona has taken great umbrage and placed a target on you to the point that he swore that he's going to try to make sure you're not reelected. What his influence was, and I think it's important that when we close this, that people understand that this didn't just happen in a vacuum. This was a planned move. You mentioned multiple times in our presentation that they did their homework. They found the right county. They found a county that they could come and intimidate, and they brought that to your community. And in the second half, we're going to talk a little bit about what your community actually faced, what it was like for you, your family, for your officers, for employees of the federal government. And we're going to really shine a light on what happened here. Folks, I hope you enjoyed part one. Part two will be next weekend. This is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich with the Sheriff's Report here on KTW, the Fabulous 630. Look forward to continue this discussion.
Kyk uit vir 'n verskeidenheid Suid-Afrikaanse films.
Not happen. Federal concerning the Mauer takeover and the. Good afternoon, folks. This is Sheriff Ozzie Knezovich with the Sheriff's Report. Last week, we started a conversation with Harney County Sheriff Dave Ward concerning the Mauer takeover and the things that happened down there. We're going to continue that discussion with the sheriff. And at the end of the last program, we said we were going to talk about the effects to his community, the effects to himself, his family, to officers that were down there, because there was a lot of intimidation that went on. And I think it's important that you understand just how bad that intimidation factor was, because, folks, true patriots don't do that to fellow Americans. I'm sorry. That just does not happen. Fellow Americans do not treat each other that way. So for them to use the term patriot, I'm like you, Sheriff. I really think they've hijacked a term. They've hijacked the sanctity, if you will, of a revolution, and they don't live up to any of those type of principles. So early on, when I started hearing more and more about this, and even before the takeover, I started looking into this because, you know, I have groups around here that feel the same way that some of these folks do. And I watched some of the things that was going on, and some of the reports coming out in the media of people slowly driving by your house, people parking in driveways, your parents being harassed, those type of things. What was it really like for your community? Because, folks, what you don't realize is how much money this cost the Harney County community, the state of Oregon, and the federal government, because it's not just a little bit of money. So, Dave, what was it really like, you know, even prior to the takeover, the intimidation started?
Well, if you start back at approximately November 19th, after they realized that I absolutely was not willing to...
that you are a law-abiding constitutional sheriff, and they couldn't handle that.
That's a good way to put it. After that, things started to step up. They started basically an internet war against us, which social media can be an amazing thing, but it can also be a tool that can be used for destruction and heartache, and all kinds of bad things can come from it when it's misused. There was a buildup of presence of these folks from these groups within our community. After about Thanksgiving, it really started becoming clear that they were present in the community. There were people that were doing basically surveillance on police officers and their families, and the employees and family members of federal agencies such as the refuge employees and the BLM employees, to the point that these folks would drive slowly past your houses and yell things out. Now, my driveway's a quarter mile long, and they would pull down in the driveway, but they didn't come all the way to the house. And there were folks that put up signs. In one case, there was a gentleman that put a sign up in his front yard that said, "Bundy, go home." And it was painted on plywood, big green letters. You may have seen it on the news or on the internet. And directly above that sign, or directly next to that sign on the same tree, is a bright orangely lettered no trespassing sign. Now, those folks walked past that no trespassing sign up onto his porch so that they could confront him about his Bundy Go Home sign. So we're talking about people who violated
property rights. That's something they always tout, isn't it? Property rights are one of those sacred things that you should never violate, but I have seen violation after violation from these folks about property rights.
Yes, to the point of cutting down a rancher's fence without permission because they felt that his cows should be able to graze on the refuge land. Never mind that we have winters that get down to 30 below out there, and if those cows get out there a ways from water, might not find their way back to it. And so I don't think they had a really good handle on the ranching lifestyle either. But that's one instance. Another instance, a local pastor, friend of mine, started a Facebook page, I believe it was. It was an anti-bullying page, and basically called these folks out for what they were doing in the community and stated it was wrong. And he ended up backing away from that and taking his family and leaving town at one point after these folks started slow rolling his house and yelling things out at him. And
now, folks, I want you to contemplate that. Where does that fit in the Constitution? Exactly where does that type of activity fit in the Constitution that these folks swear up and down that they're all about? Because they're really not. They're only about themselves. They don't care about you. They don't care about me. They don't care about the community. They only care about themselves. And that's tragic. It really is. So you and your family, your friends, your community, basically victimized, and the way they spun that, because I'm reading all this, and I'm getting it from the media. I'm also watching the social media, and they're spinning this that it was FBI agents that were doing all this.
Yeah, that was a disclaimer that Ryan Payne tried to put out on the table from day one, all the way back on November 5th, when he claimed that they were going to bring thousands of people to town. Two things he put out there. One was, we're not going to be able to control everything that they do. And the other one that he tried to leave me with on the way out the door, prior to telling me he didn't want to have to come back from Montana, was that FBI agents were probably going to come to town and do things to try to make them look bad. If you fast forward that into December, when I'm Christmas shopping with my family, and I have Blaine Cooper and John Ritzheimer following me and my 8-year-old son around in the store. And
now these are two major leaders of this takeover, folks. These aren't just two little names the sheriff just dropped out there. These were two main leaders. They were always armed, and quite frankly, Ritzheimer's one that put out the tearful goodbye to his son, saying that Daddy swore an oath and he wasn't coming home.
Yep, that would be the same guy. Those guys were not just supporters, they were involved with the armed takeover of that refuge. You take that a step farther, we had people who were on the Facebook pages of Idaho 3% following us through the grocery stores. My parents were at the American Legion, helping them with their American Legion yard sale when Ryan Payne, Jason Patrick, and several other people in this movement showed up in December and were passing out flyers and making statements about making the sheriff stand up and do his duty. They ended up in an argument with my mother, who's I understand that she's a scary lady. I get that. She's 74 years old, has a pacemaker. She's about 5'3". My father, who's 78 and also has a pacemaker and some health issues. My folks ended up arguing with these people. Ryan Payne came directly to my office afterwards to tell me that my parents had threatened them and wanted me to know about it. Now, during that conversation, Ryan Payne pointed out to me that I had received some death threats up to this point via email, and he pointed out that my folks had stated that I had received death threats, and he wanted to let me know he had nothing to do with it. And I found it ironic that one of the people that had sent death threats to me the very next day sent an email bashing my family and basically referencing the argument that had taken place the day before. And I thought, I hadn't even hadn't even told the FBI about him having a run-in with my folks. I hadn't put that out there, and all of a sudden I'm getting emails from basically their associates referencing the fact that they had had a run-in with my family and running my folks down. So I again, they put the information out there. They put the disclaimers out there. It's the government. Ryan Payne told me in that conversation that it was the government sending me death threats to make him look bad.
Yeah. And folks, if anybody wants to believe that, I'm sorry, it's just that's not the way it works. I've lived through what the sheriff was talking about in many of these instances because I have been very vocal about these type of groups and what they're all about. Let's fast forward a little bit, Sheriff, about the takeover. Very well planned and organized situation. It wasn't the let's just suddenly do this moment that some of the media tried to play it off as. It was a fairly calculated move.
I'd like to go back just a little bit
right
there, and this goes along with that. Is I believe that this group of people exploited this family in our community, exploited their name and the court case, and the fact that there were certain elements that lined up, such as a ranching family and the BLM, and that there were some disputes involved with land. And I believe they exploited that situation.
It was part of their pre-plan.
And absolutely, I believe they planned this months in advance. And I believe that regardless of which side of the fence I had aligned myself on, they had already planned on coming there and doing something in our community. Had I aligned myself with them, I believe it would have only given them more traction and gotten me into legal trouble as well. The leading up to the events in which they took the refuge, there was an event planned. It was supposed to be a peaceful rally. Now, all of these patriot groups were involved in doing this. However, I believe that peaceful protest march was nothing more than a smokescreen in which they again exploited a lot of good people who showed up and were participating in a lawful protest, which as Americans we have an absolute right to do.
Yes, we do.
And so there were a lot of good folks who put time and effort into showing up there and were trying to do something for this family and our community through lawful channels. And again, these people exploited that and hijacked that peaceful protest while that was going on, a contingent of these folks broke off and went out and took the refuge. Now, there was a rear element that was left back in the community, and while the refuge had been taken over and was being occupied by Bundy and his group, another portion of that element was staying in a local hotel there and continuing to follow our families around and continuing to pull surveillance on us.
It's not like they all went to the refuge, and that's kind of a misnomer that's been painted as they were all at the refuge. No, they were actually left, like you said, a major contingent in Burns, and that caused you a lot of problems in that you have all these armed people. And I want to ask you a question because one of your detractors, Richard Mack, threw this out to a reporter that I had to do a interview with this week, and he said, "Well, Sheriff Ward could have taken them at any time that he wanted to." Why don't you describe what the community meetings were like when you would have the community meetings and these folks would show up? The dynamic of what would have happened if you would have actually tried to take them into custody at that point? Because, again, folks, they have 25 armed people outside. They have basically taken over the gym, all four corners, strategically placed. There was no taking these people during those events, was there?
No, not without opening up the possibility of innocent blood being shed. And I think as we saw how events unfolded on January 26th, how far some of the people in these groups were willing to take things, I will go back to say that our sheriff's office is in the middle of a residential neighborhood, basically, and the old junior high school across the street, which the school district was kind enough to allow us to use, is where we had our command center set up. And when these folks would come up there wearing body armor and sidearms and that, and confront the people that are on the checkpoints or the gates allowing people access to those areas, the possibility of innocent people getting hurt if you try to take them into custody was very real in the middle of that neighborhood. These people were showing up on Sundays in local churches and trying to solicit, support for their cause, and that we can't go into a church and take people out. My own pastor sent me a text one day and stated that one of them was sitting in our congregation with a firearm on his hip. First of all, it's not normal behavior in our area to be wearing guns into church. And furthermore, I believe it was just a further attempted intimidation of that pastor. Again, not a place that you can go and take somebody into custody when they've already made threats of bloodshed if you were to attempt. We had information as far back as December in which we received intel based off of their social media posts that they had put out a call to arms in which they requested 10 shooters to come and act as bodyguards for Ammon Bundy and Ryan Payne in the case that law enforcement attempted to take them into custody, and were authorizing lethal force to prevent that. So we knew that the possibility of shots being fired in one of those incidents was a very real, very real scenario.
And the reality of that, folks, is you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to take the sheriff's word for it. All you have to do is Google and watch their own rhetoric. They put that stuff out on YouTube. They put it out on their social media sites. Again, Ritzheimer and his tearful goodbye to his son. Finicum made it very clear, I'm not being taken. I won't go to a jail cell. I won't. And, they had committed to the end of their mission. We brought up Richard Mack a few times, and again, he's hot on your trail. He, quite frankly, folks, I've found Rich not to be exactly truthful, and some of the things that he says and does is amazing. He was at the protest when it happened, but more importantly, and I think what you mentioned, it was November 5th, an hour after that meeting, Richard Mack gives you a call.
Richard Mack gives me a call on November 5th, not long after Ammon Bundy and Ryan Payne left my office. And on that date, he called me up and said, hey, I understand you've got a situation going on out there with this family that's, having run-ins with the BLM and getting sentenced back to prison. And at that time, I was not familiar with the Hammond case. I truly wasn't. I hadn't been sheriff at the time, and I really needed to research things. And I had a pleasant enough conversation with Richard Mack. He told me that Ammon Bundy was a pretty good guy, and I had a conversation with him, thanked him for the offer of any assistance that he was offering me, and went on about my business. Now, if you fast forward that into January 2nd, while I'm watching a live feed of done by Pete Santilli of this protest that's going on, I see Richard Mack's face right there, in my Safeway parking lot there in our community. He never let me know, hey, I'm coming up there to be involved in this. But after they took the refuge, I received another phone call from him on January 3rd, in which he wanted to let me know he was very upset that they had taken the refuge and he had no part of it. But he led into telling me that he had an idea of how I could maybe sidestep this whole thing with the Hammonds and the federal government, and that was that maybe I should just go take the Hammonds into custody, that they didn't really have to do anything wrong, just make up some charges and take them into my custody.
So basically lie, arrest them under false pretense, which is a direct violation of the very Constitution that Richard Mack claims that he supports, and it's his group that he has titled Constitutional Sheriffs, which is a bunch of garbage. He's not about the Constitution. He's about himself. If you go to the Constitutional Sheriff's website, which I'm sure you probably have, it's all about buy my book, buy my tape, invite me to come and speak. And it's about him, and he's sitting there telling you to violate your oath of office,
Right.
to violate state law, federal law, and the Constitution, which is just dumbfounding to me, that the double standards and double rhetoric that come out of, away from this individual. And he's one of those individuals that, folks, you need to understand. All the people that the sheriff has been mentioning, the assemblywoman from Nevada, Richard Mack, they're all together. Mm-hmm. They are part of what's called the Coalition of Western States. They are part of that. They're their leadership. And it's not a mystery that the assemblywoman, I can't remember her name. Michelle Fiore, calls you right before the Bundys show up, and then the Bundys show up, and it's Richard Mack that calls you an hour later. There's no mystery here, folks. It's fairly laid out. Now, I'll tell you, if you really want to get to the bottom of kind of that connection, the Oregon Public Broadcasting Association did a huge multi-story article on this that outlines the exact linkages to each and every one of these people, which includes one of our own state representatives, Matt Shea. Matt Shea started the Coalition of Western States in Arizona, or in Nevada, at the Bundy Ranch. Mac continues to make a lot of claims about you and everything else. I admire the fact that you stood your ground, that you did show that you are a true constitutional sheriff. And, just know that there are sheriffs across the United States that truly admire the way that you've conducted yourself in this. If you had something that you really wanted people to understand in the last 5 minutes here, because I want to just turn it over to you, one of the most important and most impactful statements that you made, both in the media and when you and I talked on the phone during this situation, was this. And you said it twice. You said, Sheriff, if these people get away with doing this in this community, and quite frankly, folks, they got away with it in Nevada, there will be no small community safe in this nation. And Sheriff Ward, I have to agree with you on that. They have to be held accountable, because what they did was basically try to come in, overthrow your county government in hopes of starting a revolution that would overthrow the national government. So you've got the floor. Just leave me about 20. When it hits 27 minutes, leave me enough for a wrap up. But I want you to tell folks what you really want them to understand about what you and your community went through.
Well, I'll tell you what, it was a very trying time. I looked over my shoulder more during that time than I did in Afghanistan or Somalia. You don't know who's got it in for you. Yeah, you see these guys out there when people are walking around your sidewalks carrying firearms and that, which I'm a very pro Second Amendment guy. I firmly believe in the Second Amendment, and I believe in the entire Constitution. And I guess what I would like people to know is that I believe in the Constitution in its entirety, not just the parts that make me feel good or the parts that support my personal beliefs. Or that document was meant to be used in its entirety, and I do believe that if we allow people to arm up and try to overthrow government at any level, that it will destroy our country all the way to its roots. I believe that we have, while it's not perfect, the best system of government in the world. And I'm going to say that I don't want 3% of the people deciding for me how my life is going to be lived. I like the fact that I have a voice and that I can vote and I can pick up the phone and call my congressman or my senator and express to them my feelings without fear of repercussions. You can't do that in other countries. So the only way for our system of government to work the way it's supposed to and continue to do so is if the citizens do arm themselves with information and do inform their neighbors and do go out to the polls and vote and contact their elected representatives and make sure that we are all on that same sheet of music. Because when I don't get my way at the polls, what it means is our system still worked and that the majority of our countrymen actually voted, and that's how people meant for it to be. So I guess that's what I'd like to say on that.
You know, again, we could go on forever on this topic, because there's a lot of things that we haven't even been able to even scratch the surface on. The bottom line, I think, and the takeaway for me was that this was an organized attempt. They did their research. They found a cause, a local cause, and then they tried to separate your government. They formed these things called citizen...
the Committee of Safety.
Committee of Safeties. Goes back to Revolutionary War.
It does.
And it was designed to undermine your government, get support for their beliefs, because they needed that local flavor. What really drove home for me was the importance of information and truth. And we can't beat them at the social media game because we don't have the time in our lives, because they have dedicated people that sit in their basements and troll and blog all the time. That's where it comes down to the folks that are in the room with us, the media, to really dive in and really get a good feel for this, because I know the 24-hour news cycle has destroyed journalism. And that's where it's really going to come down to. Our only hope to combating all this nonsense is people get the truth. And these folks are not about the truth. They're not, folks. I have dealt with them ad nauseum, and I've called them out on it. They're not about the truth. Gavin Syme and burning cows, that was pirated from somebody in your county, and he got away with that. Sheriff, I really appreciate you coming in. I really appreciate you spending some time with
Voting works. You can call your congressman. Who the hell can call their congressman? You can't call your congressman. I've tried. A secretary answers. Sure, we'll tell them all about it. Sure, won't remember you. Okay, thank you for calling. Okay, what's your email address? We'll respond there. Okay, well, I'm calling because, this is broken and 766. Okay, we'll be sure to respond to you. About a week later, you get an email. Yes, we are very concerned about your issues with the tobacco tax. Oh my God, that's so... Well, and I saw all the call to actions. None of them were calls to arms. Only calls to arms I saw came from the feds. Oh, Lord. My stomach hurts. I've had my mic muted most of the time because all this is just so freaking hilarious. Where does this even come from? You know what this is here? My authority. How dare you disturb my authority? My authority. Don't you stand up against my authority. Oh, well, Don Knotts, live long and prosper. Because the spirit of Barney Fife is spreading its ass all over America. I'll be back later. I just wanted to get this. I wanted to get this comedy piece out. I don't get to do comedy very often. So I'm going to buffer out and while you do the Heimlich maneuver and run to the hospital trying to get that big pill swallowed, I'll go ahead and buffer out and I'll be back with you in a little while. Seriously though, folks, what a bunch of crap. Oh yeah, and closing thought for the day, just because it says analgesic cream or analgesic pain relieving cream does not mean it's like preparation H, not at all.